tariffs come into play and protectionism comes back, what will happen is the United States economy will decrease. Things manufactured in the United States will cost a lot more than the rest of the world will have to buy. They will have a reduced export capacity, while the rest of the world integrates more closely with China, which is a much more stable, non-problematic global neighbor. I'll just ask you a question. How many countries has China invaded in the past 70 years?
2.
When was the last one?
73, I want to say, 75.
How many countries has the United States invaded in the past 70 years?
On the advice of counsel, I decline to answer.
You have to go to Wikipedia and count them all up because it's a lot.
Michael Barnard, returning champion, back here with us on Wicked Problems. There are so many hats that you have. Like your neck is like doing a whole thing, so I'm not sure like even how to credit you. Forbes contributor, proprietor behind The Future's Electric, consultant to people around the world. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. And let's talk about the latest hat just briefly. Trifecta Ireland, a new NGO, which is going to be working towards clean, affordable, and secure energy for all. Initially formed out of the Eddie O'Connor's family fund. Eddie O'Connor of Mainstream Renewables and Electricity fame and Super Grid Super Solution handbook
I think you're in
for
that.
decarbonized Europe.
So
I assisted with the second edition, and I was there for the launch in Brussels last year. Just the last time you and I saw each other face to face.
Indeed. R.I.P. Eddie, and I think it's an amazing, his vision, what he's created. So super interesting about Trifecta. We might come back to that at the end, because as you know, I have a great love for Ireland, having lived there for 10 years and for various other reasons. But look, man, it's been a minute since you and I have spoken on air, right?
Yes.
So, and some things have happened. And as we were talking in the green room, like I've been in a pretty dark place, which I think you noticed, and you were like, Richard, you okay? So tell me why I should be okay, Michael.
Well, people ask me this all the time. They say, Mike, are you optimistic? And I always say, yes, I am. For certain values of the term optimistic.
Okay.
We're not going to hit 1.5. We're not going to hit 2.0. And that's not because I'm fatalistic. We have to keep striving.
This is the math.
The math is the math, and the reality of humans being really crappy at doing stuff intelligently in groups is what it is. We're going to hit 2.5 to 2.7 degrees in that range. I've known that for a while. I've come to terms with it. And there's good news there, because much as global warming sucks, global glaciation sucks more. And in 50,000 years or so, we're going to come out of this current interglacial period called the Holocene, maybe it's called the Anthropocene, and the glaciers will start coming down from the mountains again. And it would be really nice to have our hands on the thermostat, and we will. So that's the good news out of this. In the meantime, there's going to be a bunch of disruption. The thing I'm most concerned about is displacement of climate refugees, potentially 14 times as many as the Syrian refugee crisis by 2050. That's a big political disruption. Building resilience of institutions and economies in the global south is an actual necessity for the developed world, because guess where they're all going to try and go. So, and I actually had a great couple of beers in Brussels when I was there with an economist working for the central banker. And he said, how can economists help? And I said, they're not paying enough attention to that. There's a value proposition. There's a business case for doing the assessment of climate risk versus resiliency or fragility of the economy that enables us to invest in those specific places to decrease the likelihood of climate refugees out of those places in the future, causing significant economic and political disruption. But once again, that's certain values of the term optimism. But the second thing is, we got all the solutions and we're hammering them in at pace. There's just so much good stuff going on right now that's a bit masked by a certain egotistical orange buffoon and his temper tantrums and his unconstitutionality. And I think we should just not talk about that orange buffoon anymore.
I agree, because like if we do, we get shadow banned by YouTube in particular. So as it turns out, that we don't get any distribution when that
Oh
name
no.
comes. I mean, for me, I wanted to ask you about reasons for optimism. One of them we talked about in the green room was Pakistan.
Mhm.
So tell me more about that.
So Pakistan's an interesting case. It's just a country born out of absurd political upheaval. When the British were leaving, they decided, oh, we're going to put all the Muslims in one country and we're going to put all the Hindus in another country.
Hmm.
And oh, by the way, we're going to put the Muslims in two countries that are separated by the middle country.
Yeah.
2 million people died in that great sorting out of population,
Hmm.
um, imposed upon Pakistan and India. And then later on, the two parts of the Muslim countries went, we can't
Hmm.
work together like this. And so
Hmm.
Pakistan is born out of that. And then
Hmm.
they've got a long border with Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And so after all that horrific birth, they were subject to the Russians invading Afghanistan and causing massive upheaval and devastation on their border. And then the United States was funding the bad guys in the end, who were the good guys then, to defeat the Soviets. And that was
Hmm.
all in Pakistan. So the CIA was all over Pakistan, creating more problems.
Yeah.
And then you end up with the Americans invading Afghanistan and recycling the entire thing.
You're
And then
welcome,
you end
by the
up,
way.
yeah, and then you end up with warlords and you end up with dictators. And this is the story, if anybody's familiar with Pakistan, that most people think of when they think of
Hmm.
Pakistan.
Hmm.
But now they've had peaceful transitions of democratically elected people,
Hmm.
I think 4 times now.
Yeah.
Now, Kishore Mahbubani talks about the great improvement in governance in Asia and the global south that is
Hmm.
mostly ignored in the West. And the reason for
Hmm.
that is we have our historical perspectives and we don't keep up to date. Like
Hmm.
China is the classic example. Pretty much all stereotypes about China are wrong.
Well, let's come to that in a moment.
But
For
back to
Pakistan,
Pakistan.
yeah.
Yeah. So, A, peaceful transition of power. They're drifting down on the global democracy index a bit over the past couple of elections. So it's
Hmm.
imperfect.
Yep.
Certainly, people in Pakistan I've spoken to, or people from Pakistan, anybody who's left a country ends up with impassioned perspective about it.
Yep.
Um, so that's part of what's happening. Now, they have reconductored more of their transmission lines than the
Hmm.
West has by a long shot. And
Hmm.
there's a really good reason for that. They're a
Hmm.
hot country. Now, transmission, normal transition, if we see transmission lines marching across the horizon, most of
Yep.
those that we see in the West have steel cores wrapped in unannealed aluminum.
Hmm.
And that works fine where the temperatures don't get above 35 or 40 degrees.
Right.
So
Yes.
now we have the problem where the steel core, as it warms up, it expands and the cable sags. And then if the cable sags too far, then it causes problems and then it can break if it gets too hot. And so
Yep.
we have this problem in the West where we are talking about reconductoring. That TCS is a great firm where they put a carbon fiber through the middle of the core and they put annealed aluminum. Because one of the things is
Hmm.
it gets too hot, the
Right.
aluminum on normal transmission and the characteristics change.
Hmm.
But if you pre-anneal the aluminum, then you know
Hmm.
what the characteristics are and it's well annealed, right? And
Right.
so carbon fiber is much lighter. It doesn't sag. When you reconductor transmission, you can actually put a lot more power for a
Hmm.
reconductor line on the same towers,
And
or you can put
is
on
that
fuse.
yeah? I mean, but is that the main story in Pakistan?
No,
For
no, no,
me,
no.
like,
This is just the start of the story.
yeah.
This is just the teaser. They've reconductored
Yeah.
vastly more of their transmission than the West has.
Right.
They're hot. And so they're, I always live by the words of William Gibson, the author. If you haven't read William Gibson and you read science fiction, as we discovered Michael Lee Bright doesn't not too long ago, then
The
William
future
Gibson,
is here.
bingo. Pakistan for reconductoring is a part of the future.
Very
All
cool.
over, we're getting hotter, but they've already done it. And so they didn't do it with TCS because TCS is the poster child in the West. Guess
Mm,
what? This isn't rocket science. They're getting it from China.
yeah.
And so it was Chinese efforts. They've got a big
Mhm.
HVDC north-south connector. So once again, doing more with transmission. So that's part of the
Right.
story.
Right.
Electricity was expensive and they're going through a transition and they had some challenges with corruption and utilities.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say the southeast of the United States and corruption and utilities aren't exactly a poster child for good governance.
Right.
Um, but so then there's this problem that the West was talking about last year,
Mm,
which was like cheap solar panels flooding the markets and, the glut of solar panels. And this
right.
was overproduction in China,
Mm,
like so much solar they
mm,
can build
mm.
every year. They have so much capacity. And it's a
Yep.
cutthroat. China's business environment is so competitive.
Yep.
People think of it as, the communist confuses people, but it's a very competitive market economy with a bit more governance from the top and thankfully an ongoing industrial policy.
Mm,
So that's all those cheap solar panels. The West
mm.
thought those were a problem somehow and started putting tariffs on Chinese goods. The rest of the world said, give me some of that at low
Ace.
prices.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
everybody in
Yeah.
Pakistan started
Yeah.
hammering in solar. At the beginning of
Right.
the year, they had about 5 gigawatts of rooftop solar, which
What
is
year?
that was 20 end of 2023, beginning of
Right.
2024.
Right.
And so then at the end of 2024, they had 22 gigawatts. They
Right.
imported and slapped on 17 gigawatts of solar,
Which is like,
blowing away the utilities, by the way. That all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, our net metering schemes are
yeah.
unaffordable.
Which and basically, I mean, like 17 gigawatts is basically the same scale as Texas
Yeah, as
in
much as Canada.
a given year, right? So like Jenny Chase, friend of the show from BNF, like
Mhm.
she's talked about this extensively.
Believe
I
it or not,
think,
I actually remember her name because I've heard it so often and I've listened to her, but I've never met her. So,
well, again, it was a near miss when we were both in,
right.
yeah. Some other time, Jenny, if you're listening, Michael, I'm sure, is a friend of geese, aren't you, Michael?
Especially Canadian geese, which we like to refer to as cobra chickens.
There you go. So, Jenny, if you're listening, let's make this happen. But basically, yeah, she's great. Like somebody's been on this beat for like
Mhm.
20 years, literally.
Yep.
And like,
And Michael,
yeah,
Michael
well,
Lieber's second reference.
exactly. So, like, and as she tells it, was the like, she drew the short straw, right? Back 20 years ago. Oh, you do solar. Yeah, no one cares about that. Surprise. Anyway, I think Pakistan is interesting because it does speak to something that's happening all around the world. Doesn't matter about policy, doesn't matter what your preferences are. Like, if there's some cheap way to get power to be able to actually, light up a light so that your teenage daughter can read a book to study for her exams, guess what? You're going to do that, right? If you can do that. And Pakistan seems like it's the index case of what happens when enough people have just enough cash to decide, I'm going to allocate resources over here. Then Chinese manufacturer comes up with this super abundant oversupply to get things stupidly cheap. And I feel like that's the most hopeful thing that's happened in the last 12 months. People are going to go for what works and they're not going to be insane. And I feel like for me, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah. There's another thing people think about Pakistan is that it's an undeveloped country, but it has actually a massive industrial base for
Yeah,
fabrics
totally.
and factory roofs,
Mm,
commercial warehouses. They're all covered with solar panels too. There's multiple organizations. BYD is building a factory for
mm.
cars for Pakistan.
Oh, nice.
Um, there are multiple. I think there's three major ones, and but a bunch of smaller ones who are importing Chinese electric motorcycle kits assembling them, slapping their own brand on them, and distributing them. And as BNF reported, I think it was 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, something like that, electric two and three wheelers in the global south have removed more demand for oil than all of the electric cars. It's because it's just a massive thing. Neighbor next door in India, I was one of the things I did last year was a extended seminar series framed around my short list of climate actions that will work. And
Mm-hmm.
so basically a lead off one at the plenary session at their major conference, and then a seminar every 2 to 4 weeks for months. And one of the things I discussed with Reggie Pilar, the head of the ISGF, India Smart Grid Forum, was the work they'd done in 2015 or so, 2016. They said, let's do something with policy, to your policy point. The capital cost of batteries is really high. Let's decouple the battery cost from the two and three wheeler. Let us put in place a regulation that says you can only sell them without batteries, and you must rent the batteries and create a storage facility. So it's imperfectly done, but most of the two and three wheelers just roll up to a charging stand, put in their discharge battery,
I
pull out
love
a
this.
battery, swap
Wow.
them, pay a few rupees for the process, and ride away. Battery swapping works in a couple of specific types of things for small
Wow.
vehicles in places where everybody lives in multi-unit residential
Yeah.
buildings.
Yeah.
Battery swapping makes a lot of sense. As Reggie said, it's imperfect. Now we have sometimes two or three competitive charging stations in a single village. So it's not standardized, but it's a lot better. And then of course, all the auto rickshaws. The
Mm.
auto rickshaws are the three-wheel motorized
Yeah.
little trucks that feature in stunts in Bollywood movies and Bond movies. But they've just quietly just been all converted to electric because electricity is so much cheaper.
Mm.
And so everybody's done that. They just quietly did it. The same organization did a study and they said, let's size batteries in buses to the routes.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, let's buy a bus that must be able to do all routes, let's buy buses that can do the short routes, then the medium routes, and the long routes. And as such, they bought a lot more buses. And they're planning to have 50,000 electric buses on the roads of India by 2027. For context, there was like 3,000 sold in North America last year.
Okay.
We're way behind. It's not
Mm.
just China. I think Kenya has placed an order with BYD or Yutong for 14,000 electric buses.
Wow.
It's going to be delivered over the next several years.
Mm.
This is the reality of the global south and the undeveloped world. And in part, there's a really simple story. Like Kingsmill Bond has a new thing out on the electrostate versus the petrostate.
Right. Now, Amber, previously at RMI.
Yep. Now at Amber, previously at RMI. So he no longer is in the uncomfortable position of having the hydrogen advocacy of the RMI in the same
Okay.
organization.
That's okay. Like that's a whole other thing.
Oh, it
Let's
is.
leave that for the moment. That's
I
fine.
might have to
Okay.
return to them for
Well, it's
anybody who's
fine.
wondering.
We'll come
I,
back. We'll come back.
I wrote a 14,000 word strategic assessment and recommendation to the RMI about their stance on hydrogen about a year and a half ago. And I might have to return to it because they seem to be backsliding. They've gotten better, then they seem to be backsliding again. So yeah, BYD in Pakistan, 22 gigawatts of solar in Pakistan, transmission reconductoring and HVDC transmission in Pakistan, electrifying their textile industry in
Mm.
Pakistan,
Mm.
privatizing and modernizing their electrical utilities. One of the people I spoke to, a couple of people, as a family organization, they privatized one of the electrical utilities, modernized it, and divested. Then that was about 10 years ago. Another one is privatizing. They're considering acquiring it again. And so I was talking with them about their plans there. And they're thinking all that solar on rooftops, that
Mm.
is ripe for a virtual power plant model where we take over the assets and manage them as part of the
Nice.
utility.
Nice.
So one of the threads I've been pulling, I finished a book recently, The Beginning of Everything. by a couple of historians who were trying to figure out what book they were going to write. And so they started doing a bunch of research. And what they discovered was this fascinating thing. The French, the Enlightenment, and the French principles of democracy
Mm.
mostly came because they brought North American natives to Europe, some of the best thinkers and
Well,
debaters,
Lafayette and whatever. But go on.
and all the Jesuits in North America were having these lengthy discussions with North American native thinkers. And the
Hmm.
North American native thinkers were, why are you letting that man have so much control over you? Why don't
Right.
you just leave?
Right.
And so, you know, just as in the West, we have this noble savage bullshit myth that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The First Nations chose not to
Mm.
live like
Mm.
under monarchies. And
Mm.
so the founders, the former framers of the American Constitution actually lifted a bunch of it from, I think, the Iroquois.
That's right.
Similar to our chauvinistic perspective on, non-Western philosophy and stuff, we've got this similar chauvinism about the developing world, that it's
Mm.
behind us. In
Yeah.
actual fact, they're leapfrogging us. Case in point, sub-Saharan Africa. They just didn't bother with landlines. They just went straight to cell phones.
Exactly.
And so
So
the leapfrogging is occurring.
let's talk about China. That's the animating force behind a lot of this, right? Is like the powerhouse that's been built up over the last 25 years or thereabouts. I'm from North America. People in North America tend to, as well as here in Britain, point to China and say like, "Well, I will sort out my stuff when China does, because China's the one's going to do all rah in the future." So I was looking at Carbon Brief a couple of days ago, and as it turns out, China has actually turned the corner and has a measurable decrease in emissions, which is not something that, like all the folks who are trying to demonize China said was going to be happening. So, what's the deal with that?
Well, so now the ones who are trying to demonize China are now claiming it's because their economy is tanking, which is also wrong.
Okay.
I've been projecting this, and others have been projecting this for a while. The last time we were in this, well, the only time we were in the same room together in Brussels, I put up a chart for China's carbon intensity and
Yes.
electrification,
Yes.
and they've been hammering it in. So last year, they they had, I spent some time with David Fishman of the Lantau Group. He's lives in Shanghai, speaks Mandarin, reads all their documents, power
Mm-hmm.
documents in Mandarin.
Yep.
Great guy. He had predicted in 2023 that coal would peak.
Mm-hmm.
Coal would peak in 2024 would decline, and then he was right up until September. And in September, there was a confluence of things.
Mm.
A, they'd already hammered in a lot of solar, and so up until then, the solar they'd hammered in was accommodating for all increases in power. But then they
Right.
had a major heat wave at a time when hydro, like in fall, hydro was always lower than in the spring. And so the hydro was lower than had been hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to manage water flows quite carefully in those things. You just can't let it go when it's there. You've got to maintain reservoir levels throughout the system. And coal inched up a little bit. But now, let's fast forward to Q1 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So I did the math and I said, okay, in Q1 2025, what's happened with coal versus Q1 2024? I had a hypothesis that it would be down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found out that it was down 4.7% year over year. That's a very big number. It's almost
Totally.
5%. I said, well, is electricity demand down? Well, electricity supply from the grid.
Mm.
Oh, that's
Ah.
interesting. But how much electricity was consumed?
But
It
behind the meter.
increased 2.5%. The total electricity consumed in China year over year,
Mm.
2024 to 2025 Q1,
Mm.
had increased 2.5%, while coal electrical generation went down 4.7%.
Mm.
That's a key decline. That's a growth. They also
Hmm.
had growth of 6% of steel exports, another indication their economy was in good shape. They had a massive increase in sales of new cars, 11% sale of new cars. Almost a majority were EVs. Another indicator their economy is doing just fine. Year over year car sales increase. Their economy was on track for, I think, 5.4% GDP growth.
Yeah.
And so I saw a bunch of indicators that, a standard refrain of the China haters is you can't believe everything, but you can triangulate. And if a
Right.
bunch of different things agree that we can
Mm.
measure, you can measure them. And then I want to say he's a Finnish guy, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name, Laurie something or other. Like David Fishman, he spends all of his time, and I apologize, Laurie. I do deeply apologize for not being able to attempt your name. But Laurie spends all of his time, like David Fishman, solely on China. He looks at it, he pays attention. I believe he reads Chinese as well, and so he was the one who did the work for Carbon Brief on carbon emissions. Um, and so he looked at it and said, "Okay, let's look at China's emissions from March 2024 all the way through March 2025." And he found over that time a 1% decrease in emissions. And in that time, China's economy grew once again in the 5 to 6% range. Now, people are talking about the great economic slowdown in China. But I'd like to point out that the West would kill for 5 to 6%
Oh my God.
economic growth.
Of course.
It's just very funny that the headlines. I've got a PDF I maintain now because it stopped in 2017. It's list from 1990 of all the headlines about China's about
Right.
to collapse economically. And
Yeah.
so I found it again recently and I updated it.
The Economist loves those.
He does.
Yeah, they do. I love that. So, but China is,
One last thing on
yeah,
China. Almost half of China's economic growth for 2024 was for clean technology.
right, right.
Wind, solar,
Battery,
EVs,
EVs.
transmission
Yes,
lines, high speed
yes,
rail.
yes.
As the term electrostate is now, I think, gaining common usage.
Hmm.
I don't know who coined it. I'll have to look that up.
Like, but again, like, which one would you rather be? And like, unless you're a complete muppet, like, there's no question, right? We have certain political leaders in certain countries who desperately, desperately, desperately want to sell the story that would be so much better if we just kept using technology that's 100 years old to do stuff. And yeah, I'm not I'm not sure where that goes. Look, we wanted to keep it optimistic, but I do also need to ask you, based in North America, about your observations. We talked, gosh, a year and a half ago now, on this show about how the kind of China demagoguery was playing out in North America. Like Canada, like God bless you, like good, good job, guys. So we can just give you guys a green check and just say, great, come back to that. I'm from the States, different story. But the situation with China, I see op-ed after op-ed about like it's terrible. China, despite the fact that the United States, in many cases, helped to develop the technologies, right? And then sell them off for buttons or nothing, right? China has now come to dominate the supply chain for critical minerals in EVs, batteries, solar PV,
Increasingly, wind turbines.
increasing wind turbines, right? So like now the Yanks are like, we're oh gosh, we didn't mean like that. You're sitting in Canada, like how do you keep your head not exploding from the cognitive dissonance of hearing Yanks say like it's terrible what's happening when of course the Yanks are the people who made this happen. Help make sense of it.
So there's a bunch of good things about globalism and neoliberalism. Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, the growth of the World Trade Organization, the growth of global trade, the free trade movement, those had a lot of really good things about them.
Mm-hmm.
They have reduced poverty substantially globally. They brought better education, the internet around the world. They brought satellite, and we've got all sorts of positive measures globally. Life expectancy is going up globally, except in the United States. Education is going up everywhere except in the United States, et cetera. Affluence is going up,
For except the United States. Yeah.
well, for the bottom 60% of people.
Yeah.
So we had a little bit of a backwards movement during COVID, but we've had a lot of positives there. Vaccination and treatment of communicable diseases. We have more ease of disease travel, but we have the World Health Organization and a global vaccination program that's eradicating communicable diseases, except in the United States. And so there's some backsliding. The same people tended to have a free market ideology, and they believed part of that free market ideology was the market would always make the right decisions. And the market doesn't make the right decisions, it makes the cheapest decisions. It
Right.
finds the cheapest solution, but you have to ask it the right questions and you have to make sure it's valuing the right things. So, climate change is arguably a failure of the market economy for not internalizing the negative externalities of fossil fuels,
Hmm.
among other stuff, and land use and stuff. But one of the other things that it did in the West, especially in the UK and in the United States, is, well, industrial policy,
Mm.
right? And the United States has done very well with the market economy because, among other things, it used to have a global conveyor belt of intelligent, talented, hardworking people to the United States to be
Hmm.
educated. They
Yep.
welcomed them with somewhat open arms. And, up until recently,
Mm.
50% of America's Fortune 500 companies
Yep.
were immigrants or
Yep.
children of immigrants.
Hmm.
America did incredibly well with this process.
Yep.
Not
That's over
anymore.
now.
Yeah, that's over now. But America's loss is the world's gain. And so, yes, but the next thing is technology diffuses. You can't stop technology diffusion.
Hmm.
So China is fracking. I was reading Chinese scientific papers about the engineering challenges related with overlapping stimulation zones, challenges of overfracking a single zone, collapses, pipe sharing, and stuff like that.
Mm.
India is fracking. This is a
Hmm.
technology. Solar panels, let's just take wind turbines. So America invented stuff. Let's just take that. In 1890, a Scottish person, a Danish person, and somebody in, I think it was Illinois in the United States,
Mm.
all invented generating electricity from wind turbines in the same year, completely separately.
Mm.
Co-invention is just a thing. The photovoltaic effect, yeah, it happened to be invented, depending on who you talk to, in Europe or in the United States.
Sure.
Batteries in Europe or the United States. Some of that is a story I tell ourselves, but sure, they did some stuff. The United States put a bunch of stuff through there, but then they didn't have an industrial policy.
Yeah.
And so, I take critical minerals. Critical minerals I spent a lot of time on, including recently through Jefferies Bank and Investment Bank, which is, I think, the sixth largest. No, I think it's now the fifth largest in the United States, which makes it one of the
Hmm.
biggest ones globally. They get that email back every once in a while to talk to their global investor clients on subjects pertinent to the stuff that I talk about. And this
Right.
time was critical minerals, because China quietly put export licensing requirements on a bunch more critical minerals. So the United States isn't going to be getting any.
Right.
When I talked to Gavin Mudd, who's the director of the Center for Critical Minerals Intelligence for the British Geological Surveyors, I said
Hmm.
to him, he's an Australian guy, washed up in the UK to lead one of the leading geological surveys focused on critical minerals. So be
Yep.
engaged with the government on their current trend and that stuff.
Yep.
But I said, Gavin, isn't the critical part mean that they should have been paying attention to this? Like it's got like I did the analysis. There's like 7 different ways we can assess the criticality of things. One is national security,
Mm.
and so as we look at this, it's like, why did the United States let all these things go when their military is so powerful?
Yep.
It's just a very interesting question. But it gets
Mm.
back to the United States and the West don't want dirty mines or dirty processing or dirty refining of minerals in their territories.
Yep.
And if somebody else will do it cheaply and the pollution is somewhere else, we can all
Mm-hmm.
pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then we can blame China for having pollution for doing all the stuff we didn't want to do. Oh, and
Yep.
by the way, China started cleaning up all of its processing of critical minerals in 2010. Now they actually have clean rooms where it occurs.
Look. Yeah.
So the we lost the plot. We lost a strategic plot, and now in the industrial policy in the West is back in favor.
Mhm.
Two things: the IRA for the United States was what I would argue in one case was a Marshall Plan for red states and red counties. It was
Yeah.
going to bring to an aggrieved, left behind population good paying jobs in a modern economy, which of course is why it's under attack now. But
What?
arguably, the current administration has an industrial policy as well. It's just a
Okay.
stupid one.
Okay.
It's just not going to work.
Well,
And
you're
so,
the. So what is it?
so let's take critical minerals. The Biden administration for the IRA was not an extraction, a mining thing. It was
Mm-hmm.
a processing and refining mid tier, and
Yep.
it was a demand,
Yep.
batteries, EVs, stuff like that. So it was creating the technologically advanced part wherever the critical minerals happen to be extracted, which
Mm-hmm.
is to a great extent what China had done as well,
Mm.
as if you don't need to process, refine, or have a demand for the critical
Of
minerals.
course.
And of course, the secondary part is the industrial policy includes land grabs of places where there are critical minerals. So the processing, so the extraction won't occur on American soil either.
Right. Right.
So there it's quite blatant. The second thing is the tariffs are intended to bring back manufacturing to the United States by making imported manufactured goods from the dominant manufacturer very expensive. So that is an industrial policy. It's just a broken one because manufacturing doesn't work like that. You have to have consistency, you have to have regulatory consistency because building manufacturing takes time and a knowledge that you have regulatory and economic consistency over an extended period. And the thrashing we've seen out of the current administration related to on again, off again tariffs and the stuff that's coming through, like the current bill that's passing through the House, which basically removes all that stuff, in many cases, disrupting all the economic decisions for clean technology and manufacturing in the United States. You know, every investor I've spoken to for the past 4 months has said no long-term investments in the United States. We just can't do it. Speculation and volatility trading, sure, but investing in something in an asset in the United
Mm.
States is very difficult
Mm.
to do. So once again, it is an industrial policy. It's just a broken one. It's just radically stupid.
Right.
If tariffs come into play and protectionism comes back, what will happen is the United States economy will decrease. The things manufactured in the United States will cost a lot more than the rest of the world will have to buy. They will have a reduced export capacity, while the rest of the world integrates more closely with China, which is a much more stable, non problematic global neighbor. I'll just ask you a question. How many countries has China invaded in the past 70 years?
Two.
When was the last one?
73, I want to say. 75.
How many countries has the United States invaded in the past 70 years?
On the advice of counsel, I decline to answer.
You have to go to Wikipedia and count them all up because it's a lot. And how many countries has China committed extra jurisdictional drone strikes, assassinations on?
I decline to answer.
And how many has the United States, right? So we have this situation where China is in a different stance than it was before 2008, but it's still a really good neighbor. Kishore Mahbubani says this again very clearly. He says, in Asia, we've been on the border with China all along. And in Asia, we're looking at the West and wondering, why are you guys always at war? You know, we haven't had a
Yeah.
war here.
Yeah.
Our economies are growing. Governance, which he defines as caring for the people instead of exploiting people,
Yeah.
right? The government, all governments, most governments in Asia and the global south have figured out that the best thing they can do for themselves
Mm.
is to actually care for their people, improve the lot of their people. And so there's a global groundswell of good governance, regardless of what economic system it's labeled under.
Well, look,
Yeah, so yeah, we have this in the West, we have a perception that the rest of the world is backward, that China is evil. But I will share some stuff that the administration has done, which is very interesting, which is very positive for the global perspective of reality.
okay.
Did you know that US Congress approved a funding bill and has for a few years for $400 million of anti-China, anti-Belt and Road disinformation for the that's one of the few success stories of Doge was and some of the cuts that have been made.
Okay.
They've stopped funding. I remember there's a right-wing think tank based out of Australia, which gets a lot of funding, or did previously got a lot of funding from the United States to focus on anti-democratic white papers about China. And somebody from the Ivy League school was complaining they lost their funding. There's US aid was funding an awful lot of pro-American media outlets.
Well, yeah, exactly. The entire Voice of America, you know,
Voice of
iced.
America. And
Yeah.
so, this is just part of the same failure to understand the levers of useful power that is occurring in the administration. And this is going to be to the benefit of the world. We're going to stop seeing nearly as much of people getting force fed the American perspective on how great America is and how bad China is. And, because America has turned all of its allies into best frenemies, at best people who will sign short term deals to get what they can out of the transaction, and that certainly not trust the country anymore. There's a major step backwards in terms of global goodwill. Well, guess what country is going to get benefit of that? Well, China. Everybody is now talking to China. We're pretending in Canada we're not talking to China, but we're talking about increasing our ties east and west, increasing our ties to Europe and to Asia. And what that means in reality, guess where American crude out of the Trans Mountain Pipeline is flowing?
East.
It's a massive amount, 200 to 300,000 barrels a day is flowing to China.
Right. Right. Well, look,
So,
Mike, we gotta let you go because we're now coming up to an hour. Very super grateful for your time. We could actually literally go on, you and I, just talking for really quite a long time more. But I want to ask you two quick fire things before we let you go. One, what are the three things that you're looking at, technology stack wise, that you're going to pay attention to over the next couple of months?
so one of the things, a series I just did, I did a deep dive on geothermal.
Ah,
So there's been getting a lot of attention to enhanced geothermal, which basically means using fracking technology, but for heat.
mhm.
And then there's other fracking technology that is being used for long boreholes for heat exchange and closed loop systems,
Mhm.
neither of which stand up to any scrutiny and very ultra
No,
deep stuff.
you
I,
make me sad again, Mike.
no, 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 no. What's down there is heat, and we
Yes.
need heat. And what's down there is a
Yes.
thermal store.
Hmm.
So let's just name three major oil gas distribution retailers, like
Hmm.
utilities. Orsted, formerly Danish oil and
Dawn.
natural gas, Dawn,
Yeah.
and then Vattenfall,
Hmm.
another Northern European one, and
Hmm.
Sinopec, for people who don't know, is China's absurdly big natural gas and oil importer, extractor, refiner, processor, distributor.
Hmm.
Well, what they have in common is they're all now heat as a service, district heating and geothermal, and in many cases, geothermal providers.
Hmm.
Sinopec has 77 gigawatts of geothermal heat as a service that it's providing, especially in Northern Europe or Northern China, where it's quite cold. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, there's another utility which is doing district heating. So heat as a service, from especially with geothermal heat sinks, is a major thing for a lot of heat. One of the people I spoke to recently was Simon Todd out of Ireland, again. Ireland just keeps coming up. And he is providing, his focus is on providing through Causeway Energies geothermal industrial heat up to 200 degrees Celsius. For at a 600-meter deep aquifer, it's brackish, so there's no environmental concerns about fresh water. The temperature is higher. And then with industrial heat pumps today, he can, and with specifically out of fracking, directional drilling. That directional drilling stuff actually enables aquifer based geothermal to be exploited that was difficult before because we can drill laterally for a few kilometers to get to an aquifer. And so as we look forward in the future, this district heating grows, geothermal grows. It's a major source of heat. We have a pathway for the gas utilities, which they already know how to get below streets. They know how to run pipes below streets. They already have all the customers. And if they provide heat as a service instead of gas as a service, they have a regulatory pathway. So that's a good news story. Let's talk about Wizz Airlines, another, human expulsion of waste products.
Mike, take it away. Let's talk shit.
Okay. So Wizz Airlines, for people who don't know, is the biggest man. It's even bigger than Ryanair, apparently. It's the biggest operator of budget airlines on the planet. It also happens to have the lowest carbon emissions per passenger kilometer, in part because they have no business class. They jam us in, like veal in a pen, and that's efficient for emissions per passenger kilometer. They had 300 jets on order right now to give you a sense of
Mm,
their scale. They're a
wow.
major, major player.
Mm,
And Wizz Airlines is, I've forgotten the name of the firm, but they are contracted to buy hundreds of thousands of tons of sustainable aviation biokerosene from a provider who sets up their plants besides a human waste sewage plant. Now, this is the thing I always say about biofuels. Our waste streams from our agriculture, our forestry, our other nature based things, and ourselves are huge. Our food waste alone is 2.5 billion tons a year globally.
mm, mm.
We need hundreds of millions of tons of sustainable aviation fuel potentially. I peg at 180 million tons between maritime shipping and aviation. Others typically are higher. I'm contrarian in my projections. But every ton of biomass dried turns into zero point 0.4 tons of biofuels.
Mm.
And so if we think of just 8 billion people pooping every day, that waste stream gets aggregated into massive sewage treatment plants. The
Mhm.
sewage treatment plants have a waste stream of their own. They have biosolids, which are, well, I'm just going to say it's
Keep
organic
going.
matter in
Keep
liquid,
going. Keep going.
but without E. coli.
Yeah.
So the firm there sets up a processing plant using thermal liquefaction, and they heat the stuff up, and they end up with biochar and biocrude.
Mm,
And the biocrude then just gets sent to a refinery and processed into jet fuel. And so we have this very virtuous cycle where human poop powers Wizz Airlines.
right.
And, and this is, as I say, we have a whole bunch of places where biomass waste streams accumulate and are suitable for economically scaled and automated processing. Food industry, all the places where food aggregates in major distribution centers or is processed, that's massive amounts of food scraps that come out of that. zero
Right.
point 0.4 tons of dried food scrap, or a ton of dried food scraps turns into zero point 0.4 tons of biofuels. We have no problem in terms of this. We just have the economics to overcome. And the thing about waste stream, people pay to take it away. Industrial waste, like right now, a municipal waste averages $140 a ton to remove. Please, we'll pay you to take your feedstock. The other thing I'm paying a lot of attention to these days is ports, shipping
Mm,
ports. Just
right.
finished a series because I've been speaking shipping ports for a long time. I've been speaking shipping for a long time.
Yeah.
I've got a projection of maritime shipping through 2100. And because I'm
Hmm.
a systems thinker, I'm always saying where does this fit? Where does a decarbonized ship fit into the ecosystem of transportation? And what are the connector points? Ports are the connector points, and they're too little attention is being paid to them. So imagine if we have a world where ships are running on ammonia, methanol, biodiesel, and electrons, and you have to
Mm.
bunker in a port all four of those. And ammonia, especially, is a very nasty subject that has to be
Yeah.
bunkered separately from all the rest.
Yeah.
What are ports going to do?
Mm.
Ports are also going through a transitional time because
Hmm.
55% of tonnage is coal, oil, gas, and raw iron ore, and all of those
Okay.
are in structural decline.
Yeah.
So all the ports that are devoted to bulks are collapsing. So my thesis is that an electrified port is a
Hmm.
competitive port. An
Mm.
electrified container port today has a strong opportunity to survive and grow its share of the global maritime shipping.
Mm.
And I've had this conversation with Sahar Rashid Begi, who's the head of Maersk's APM Terminals Port Decarbonization Program. So we've been
Okay.
doing that for about 3 years. But yeah, an electrified port is one in which the port workers are healthier and live in and work in quieter environments and suffer less pollution events. An electrified port is one where the city around the port is not polluted and is
Mm.
quieter. An electrified port is one in which all the terminal tractors and cranes are electrified. All
Mm.
the harbor vessels, the tugs and the ferries and the tenders and the lighters, they're all electrified. As one in which the ships, which are at berth, are plugged into shore power instead of running diesel generators for their megawatt of draw just to operate their systems. An electrified port is one in which containerized batteries are winched, depleted ones are winched off of container ships and plugged in the terminal, and full containers are put onto the container ships. An electrified
Mm.
port is one in which the ships, as they leave the port and enter the port, and for 200 kilometers from land, run on battery power and then start burning biofuels in international waters far from human beings. And so an electrified port is a radically different one. It has offshore wind and platform mounted offshore solar. The proof point is China's coastal cities. They have a gigawatt of solar on an offshore platform. And most all cities have 15 to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in plan
Mm.
because there isn't a lot of place for big solar farms or wind farms in southeastern China.
Right.
They're full of people and buildings. So
Weirdly.
Rotterdam and Antwerp can do exactly that. And they already
Right.
are. There's already a lot of offshore wind. They can build offshore solar platforms. They can run those directly to terminate in the port. The port can be a major utility of the future, bringing in 5 times as much of electricity as it needs, powering all these vehicles and vessels, providing electricity to the city around them and to industry at the port. This is a it's I've done a series, just finished a series, which is every 5 years, incremental perspective through 2055 for these
Hmm.
ports and how they'll increase profits and future proof themselves and be competitive in this radically transforming world. I'll continue to pay attention to that.
So, fi-
Whiz, poop, ports with electrification and geothermal heat.
geothermal. Well, again, we could spend entire episodes on each of those, but I'm so grateful that Mike, you could spend your time with us, and thank you so much for for doing this on a Friday. Yeah, I mean, I could keep going, but I think like you probably have other things to do, more productive things to do with your time. So thank you.
You're welcome. I do have to turn to my bi-weekly article for Renew Economy in Australia, which
Ah,
might be about their really bad ideas about extending natural gas LNG export plants through
the North
2070.
Shelf. Yes. Well, again, our friend of the show, Keaton, was on a few days ago, and so yes, we didn't ask him about that because I didn't want to upset him more than he already was. But look, I wish you luck with that, and I wish that we could. Well, when are you in over this the water?
I land 21st of June.
Okay.
Um, TenneT, the major transmission organization for the Netherlands and Germany, is flying myself and Paul Martin in to do a alternative sensitivities scenario for the Netherlands
Hmm.
2050 energy flows. One had been done, but it's, just in terms of ensuring that their transmission planning is robust as possible, they need a variety of scenarios. And so Paul and I, being electrification maximalists, are going to
Hmm.
provide an alternate electrification maximalist scenario so that they can choose how much transmission to put in plan for the next 15 years and where,
Right.
so they can understand, are either scenario going to be right? No. But to do strategic planning, you need a variety of scenarios so that you can kind of say, if we don't do this, then we're going to disable those scenarios. But if we do this cheaply, then we enable whatever comes to pass. So that,
Right.
Tenet quite wisely is making sure they understand their options and understand the variances. And the Netherlands is going through a weird time. So I'll spend a week there, and then I'll spend 3 weeks in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Ghent with my wife.
Oh, very good. Okay. So you won't be like disappearing after a couple of days. That's great. So I will talk to you off air about making arrangements where we can hook up in Amsterdam. My wife has been hankering to go there, and sure we'll find a great coffee shop.
I'm sure we will.
Mike Barnard from Forbes, from Futures Electric, from so many more things that we could even
Clean
mention here.
Technica, LinkedIn, Trace Intercept, which is the digital water infrastructure digital twins company,
And
Trifecta Ireland.
Trifecta Ireland, exactly. So we will definitely make sure that we include some of those links because, there's only so much space in the world.
Cool. There's only so much room in show
but,
notes.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, man. And I hope to talk to you again soon on air. And it's been too long. So thanks
It
again.
has been. Yeah. And to your point about being able to keep going, I think we spoke for like 7 hours in Brussels
That's
between
right.
the dinner and the breakfast the next morning.
That's right. So yeah, I should have had a recorder out, but frankly, I think probably you and I are probably better off that I didn't do that. So look, man, good talk to you. Let's talk again in Amsterdam, soon, and have a great rest of your night.
Okay. Take care.
All right, Michael, take care.
We must stop dirty language from getting to our children's ears. We must go fight the source of it. But what is the source? Oh, that's easy. Times have changed. Our kids are getting worse. They won't obey their parents. They just want to fart and curse. Should we blame the government or blame society?
Or should we blame the images on TV?
No, blame Canada. Blame Canada. For their beady little eyes and flapping heads upon their lies. Blame Canada. Blame Canada. We need to form a full assault. It's Canada's fault. Don't blame me for my son Stan. He saw the darn cartoon and now he's off to join the clan. And my boy Eric once had my picture on his shelf, but now when I see him he tells me to fuck myself. Well, blame Canada. Blame Canada. It seems that everything's gone wrong since Canada came along. Blame Canada. Blame Canada.
They're not even a real country anyway.
My son could have been a doctor or a lawyer, rich and true. Instead, he burned up like a piggy on a barbecue.
Should we blame the matches?
Should we blame the fire?
Or the doctors who allowed it to expire?
Heck no! Blame Canada! Blame Canada! With all the hockey hullabaloo and that bitch Anne Marie too. Blame Canada! Shame on Canada! Oh, in the smoke we must cut the trash, we must dash the left, refund must all be undone. We must prevent and cause a fuss before somebody thinks of blaming us.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
If you want me, I'll be in the bar. the back of a cartoon coaster in the blue TV screen light. I drew a map of Canada